She refused to eat for 9 days. The Americans did not force her. They waited. What broke her silence wasn't an order. It was a song. It is January 1945, and the war is grinding toward its final brutal months. Across the Pacific, American forces are retaking islands one ridge at a time, at staggering cost. And on the island of Saipan, 8 months after the battle that secured it, a holding camp sits in the hills above Garapan, housing several thousand Japanese civilians who survived the fighting. Among them is a woman this story will call Hisako Tanaka. She is 26 years old. Before the war, she taught primary school in a small town outside Nagoya. She came to Saipan in 1941 with her husband, who worked for a sugar company that operated across the island. By July 1944, her husband was dead, killed in the final days of the battle. She had survived by hiding in a cave system in the island's northern cliffs with several dozen other civilians, living on what little food they could find for nearly 3 weeks after the fighting officially ended. When American Marines finally found her, she was holding a kitchen knife to her own throat. She did not use it, but she had been prepared to. The fear that drove Hisako and thousands like her into the caves was not irrational. It was the direct product of years of wartime propaganda that described American soldiers in terms designed to produce exactly this kind of desperation. That capture meant torture, that women would be violated, that surrender was a fate worse than death. Imperial Japanese military doctrine reinforced this with the principle that surrender itself was a profound dishonor, one that extended to civilians as well as soldiers. On Saipan, this doctrine produced one of the most devastating chapters of the entire Pacific campaign. In the final days of the battle, hundreds of Japanese civilians, including many families with young children, threw themselves from the cliffs at the island's northern tip, rather than fall into American hands. The site is known today as Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff, names that mark one of the war's most haunting tragedies. American forces, witnessing this from below, had tried desperately to stop it. Marines used loudspeakers, broadcasting messages in Japanese, promising safety. Some Japanese-American interpreters walked unarmed toward the cliffs, calling out to families in their own language, begging them to come down. Many did not believe them. The propaganda had done its work too thoroughly. Hisako had watched from a distance as some of the people she had hidden with in the caves chose the cliffs instead of capture. She had chosen the caves a little longer, and then eventually surrender. The camp at Susupe, where Hisako was eventually taken, held thousands of Japanese and Okinawan civilians under the administration of the U.S. Navy's military government. It was not a place of luxury. Conditions were basic. Food was rationed. Disease, particularly among the elderly and very young, remained a serious concern in the camp's early months. But it was also, by any honest measure, an attempt by the occupying administration to prevent further loss of civilian life. A task that was complicated enormously by the psychological state of the people they were trying to help. Many of the new arrivals would not eat food offered by American hands, convinced it was poisoned. Many would not allow American medical staff to examine their children. Some attempted to harm themselves rather than continue living under what they believed would inevitably become brutal occupation. Hisako was among them. For the first 9 days in the camp, she refused food. She sat in the corner of a tent shared with 11 other women, her knees drawn to her chest, and said almost nothing to anyone. The camp doctors did not force-feed her. Naval medical officers, working from guidance developed earlier in the Pacific campaign at other captured islands, had learned that forcing food on someone in this state often deepened the trauma rather than resolving it. Instead, food was simply left near her, repeatedly, without comment or pressure. It was, by the 9th day, barely touched. What changed was small and almost accidental. A young Navy corpsman named Daniel Reyes had been assigned to the women's section of the camp, partly because he had picked up a working knowledge of Japanese during training, studying with a Japanese-American instructor who had volunteered for the program, despite his own family being held in an internment camp back in the United States, a contradiction that Reyes had thought about often and uncomfortably. Reyes was not a singer by any reasonable standard, but he had grown up in a household that sang constantly, his mother humming through housework, his father singing old songs while working on the truck in the driveway. It was simply something he did without thinking, the way some people whistle. One evening, doing his rounds through the tent rows with a clipboard, he was humming an old folk tune his mother used to sing while a tray of food sat by Hisako's mat, untouched as it had been for over a week. He did not notice her reaction at first. He kept walking, but the woman in the bunk beside Hisako's later told a translator that something in Hisako's posture changed the moment she heard the tune. She lifted her head. She listened until the humming faded down the row of tents. The next evening, Reyes came through again on his rounds. He was not, at this point, doing anything deliberate. He hummed because he always hummed. He had no idea that anyone was listening for it. But this time, when he reached Hisako's tent, she spoke. It was not much. 3 words in Japanese, delivered so quietly that Reyes almost missed them entirely. He did not understand them. He stopped walking. He turned toward her. She did not repeat them. She had already looked back down at the ground. Reyes wrote the sounds phonetically on his clipboard as best he could remember them and brought them, the next morning, to the camp's Japanese-American interpreter, a soldier named George Nakamura who had grown up in California and whose own parents were, like Reyes's instructor, confined in a relocation camp in Arizona while their son served in the Pacific. Nakamura read the phonetic scrawl for a long moment. "It's part of a song," he said finally. "A lullaby. My grandmother used to sing it." What had happened, as Nakamura eventually pieced together through careful, patient conversations with Hisako over the following days, was this. The tune Reyes hummed without thinking, learned from his own mother in a household thousands of miles from Japan, bore an almost exact melodic resemblance to a Japanese lullaby called Itsuki no Komori-uta, a song from the Kyushu region that had been sung to children for generations. Hisako's own mother had sung it to her. She, in turn, had sung it to the students in her classroom outside Nagoya, in the years before the war, on quiet afternoons when the children grew restless. She had not heard it since the day American forces landed on Saipan. She had assumed, without quite articulating the thought to herself, that she would never hear anything like it again. That the world containing that song, the world of classrooms and children and ordinary, unremarkable Tuesdays, was simply gone, replaced permanently by caves and fear and the sound of artillery. Hearing it hummed, however imperfectly, by an American corpsman doing his evening rounds had cracked something open that 9 days of careful, patient kindness from camp doctors had not. It was not that the song proved the Americans were safe. Hisako was far too intelligent and had suffered too much to draw so simple a conclusion from a coincidence of melody. It was that the song proved the world she had lost was not entirely gone, that something of it had, impossibly, survived and travelled across an ocean inside the memory of a stranger's mother, and arrived here, in this camp, at exactly the moment she needed reminding that survival itself might still mean something. She ate that evening. Not much. A small bowl of rice, slowly, watched carefully, but without comment by the other women in her tent. Reyes did not learn the significance of what had happened until Nakamura explained it to him several days later. He sat with the information for a long time, turning his clipboard over in his hands. He said eventually that he wasn't sure what to do with knowing he had done something important by doing something he hadn't even meant to do. Nakamura told him there probably wasn't anything to do with it. Some things simply mattered without anyone planning for them to. What Nakamura did not tell Reyes, at least not then, was how closely the situation echoed something from his own childhood. His grandmother, who had taught him fragments of Japanese folk songs before his family's removal to Arizona disrupted that kind of quiet domestic continuity, had once told him that lullabies traveled differently than other kinds of memory. A historical fact could be forgotten, a grievance could fade, but a song sung to you as an infant, before language itself had fully formed in your mind, lodged somewhere that ordinary memory did not reach. He had not entirely believed her at the time. He was 16 and skeptical of most things his grandmother said about anything that could not be proven. Standing in a refugee camp on a recaptured Pacific island, watching a traumatized schoolteacher slowly begin eating again because an American sailor had unknowingly hummed a melody from her childhood, he found himself thinking about his grandmother's claim rather differently. The days that followed brought a kind of careful, cautious thaw to the camp's atmosphere more broadly, though Hisako's case was, even among the medical staff, considered unusually striking. Naval physicians stationed at Susupe had been documenting, since the camp's opening months earlier, what they began informally calling the silence, a pattern observed in a significant number of new arrivals, particularly women who had survived the cave systems or witnessed events at the cliffs, characterized by extended refusal to eat, minimal speech, and a kind of flat, watchful withdrawal that resisted most conventional intervention. The doctors had tried various approaches: patience, routine, the presence of other survivors who had begun to recover. Some of it helped gradually in most cases. None of it produced anything as immediate as what had happened with Hisako. A young Navy psychiatrist attached to the camp, reviewing Reyes's account second-hand through Nakamura, noted in his own informal log that the case illustrated something the formal treatment protocols had not yet articulated. That recovery from this particular kind of catastrophic loss sometimes required not reassurance about the present, but proof that some specific, irreplaceable piece of the past had not been entirely destroyed. He did not have a clinical term for it. He simply wrote, in the margin of his notes, that some people needed to be shown the world hadn't ended before they could believe they were allowed to keep living in it. Hisako's recovery, in the weeks that followed, was not sudden or complete. Grief does not resolve because of a single evening, however significant. She had lost her husband. She had watched neighbors choose the cliffs. She carried all of it forward into whatever life waited for her next. But she began slowly to participate in the camp's daily routine. She helped eventually with the children in the camp's makeshift school, set up in a repurposed supply tent by the Navy's Civil Affairs Unit, which had concluded early on that giving children something resembling normal structure, even amid catastrophe, mattered enormously for the camp's overall stability. A former schoolteacher, it turned out, was exactly the kind of person that effort needed. She taught, in the months that followed, dozens of children who had lost parents, homes, and in some cases entire extended families during the battle and its aftermath. She taught them basic arithmetic. She taught them to read. And on quiet afternoons, when the children grew restless, she taught them an old song from Kyushu, one her own mother had taught her, that had somehow survived the worst weeks of her life and found its way back to her through the unlikeliest possible channel. The other teachers in the camp's makeshift school noticed that the children in her classroom settled faster than in most others, particularly in the difficult first minutes after lunch, when restlessness typically ran highest. None of them knew the reason. Hisako never explained it, and the song itself, hummed quietly while she worked at her small desk, seemed to require no explanation for the children themselves, who simply found it soothing in the way children find familiar things soothing, without needing to know why. George Nakamura, the interpreter who had translated those first whispered words, served through the remainder of the war in similar camps across the Pacific, working to bridge exactly the kind of catastrophic misunderstanding that had driven so many Saipan civilians to the cliffs rather than risk capture. His own family remained in Arizona until the camps were closed in 1945. He visited them only once during his service, a complicated homecoming that he rarely discussed afterward in any detail. Daniel Reyes finished his Navy service in 1946 and returned to civilian life. He went on to become, somewhat improbably given his own description of his singing voice, a high school music teacher in Southern California, a career he attributed, when asked, to a strange thing that happened on Saipan that I still don't fully understand. Hisako Tanaka eventually returned to Japan in 1946 as part of the broader repatriation of Japanese civilians following the war's end. She resumed teaching, this time in a rebuilt school outside Nagoya, not far from where she had grown up. She taught for over 3 decades. Former students, interviewed decades later by researchers studying the post-war experiences of Saipan survivors, remembered her as patient, exacting, and occasionally inclined, on quiet afternoons when the classroom grew restless, to sing them a particular lullaby from Kyushu. None of them knew until much later why that particular song seemed to mean more to her than the others she sometimes sang. The story of Hisako Tanaka and Daniel Reyes survives today mostly through Nakamura's later writings and a handful of oral history interviews conducted decades after the war, when Pacific theater historians began systematically documenting the experiences of Saipan's civilian survivors before that generation was gone entirely. It is a small story in the scale of a war that killed tens of millions of people. It changed no battles. It altered no strategy. It appears in no official military history. But it sits at the center of something the larger history rarely captures: the precise, unpredictable mechanism by which a person decides, after losing everything, that there might still be a reason to keep living. Sometimes that mechanism is large, a rescue, a reunion, a clear and dramatic act of mercy, and sometimes it is smaller than anyone could have planned for. A tune hummed without thinking, carried across an ocean inside a stranger's memory, arriving at the exact moment someone needed proof that the world they had lost might not be entirely gone. Hisako never learned to sing in English, but for the rest of her life she could hum without any explanation needed. A melody that two very different mothers, on two very different sides of the widest ocean in the world, had once sung to their children for no reason other than love.